Make it quick, rancher. I won't scream, said the wounded Apache girl who was stuck under the canyon. The sun was just beginning to climb above the jagged cliffs of the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red. The air was dry and warm, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. Thomas rode slowly along the narrow trail, his horse picking its way carefully over the uneven ground. He had been traveling this route for many years, bringing supplies to the distant ranches and checking on cattle that often wandered too close to the canyon's edge. Today, however, something felt different. The usual quiet of the morning seemed heavier, almost watchful, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. Thomas tightened his grip on the reins and scanned the cliffs with sharp eyes. The wind whispered through the narrow passage, moving loose gravel down small channels carved by years of water and wind. He was used to these sounds, yet today he caught something unusual, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that did not belong to the canyon. It was a voice, weak but clear, calling for help. "Please, someone, help," it whispered. At first, Thomas thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him, or perhaps a coyote trapped in a small cave. But then the voice called again, slightly louder, urgent yet steady. Thomas's heart quickened. He knew that no one traveled these parts at this hour without reason, and he had learned over the years that in the canyons every sound meant something. Slowly, he urged his horse toward the source, careful to keep the animal steady on the narrow path. Every step brought him closer to the voice, and with each step he could hear the pain and fear beneath the words, boast. Finally, he rounded a bend in the canyon wall and stopped. There, trapped under a fallen rock ledge, was a young girl. Her dark hair fell in disarray around her face, and one arm was pinned beneath a jagged stone. Her clothes were torn, stained with dirt and blood. Despite her injuries, her eyes were bright, alert, and full of defiance. "Baba." She looked at him with a mixture of fear and boldness, as if daring him to hesitate. Thomas dismounted quickly, his boots crunching against the gravel. Breaths. "I'm here to help," he said softly, not wanting to frighten her further. But the girl only fixed him with a steady gaze and spoke with surprising courage for someone so young. "Make it quick, rancher! I won't scream!" Her words startled him. There was a strength in her voice that he did not expect from someone in her condition. He looked around, taking in the scene carefully. The rock above her arm was heavy and unstable, and he knew that moving it wrong could make her injuries worse. He knelt beside her, examining the stone and the way it was pressing down on her. "Desk, I'm going to lift it slowly," he said, trying to reassure her. "Just hold on. You're safe with me." The girl did not respond, but her eyes softened ever so slightly. Thomas could see that she was terrified, but also wary. She must have been through something horrible to be this alert, even when trapped and hurt. Best. He glanced around the canyon, noting the steep drop-offs and loose stones. There was no time to waste. He set his back and arms against the boulder and pushed carefully. Slowly, with the grinding sound of stone against stone, it began to move. "Careful," the girl whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas nodded, focusing on the task. Inch by inch the rock shifted, and finally it was free. He immediately reached for her arm, checking for broken bones and bruises. The injury was severe, but not life-threatening. She flinched at the touch, but did not pull away. Thomas's heart sank at the sight of the blood, but he tried to remain calm. Panic would not help either of them. "Can you move your arm?" he asked gently. The girl nodded, wincing as she tried to lift it.
"Good," he said. "I'm going to help you up now."
He grabbed her carefully under the shoulders,
lifting her with steady, measured movements.
but did not cry out, living up to her promise. When she was free of the rocks, he noticed how small and fragile she looked in the harsh canyon light. Yet her spirit seemed unbroken. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft now but still full of pride. Thomas gave a faint nod, unsure how to respond. He had never met someone so young with such courage. "What happened?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing down at the rocks and then at the cliffs above them. My village. We were attacked. I ran, and I fell." Her words were clipped, careful, as if speaking more than this might make her vulnerable again. Thomas's jaw tightened. He knew the stories of conflict between settlers and native tribes in these parts. Yet, looking at her now, he felt something beyond fear or duty. He felt compassion. Brit, she was a child, alone and wounded, and he could not leave her here. "We need to get you out of the canyon," he said firmly. "Can you walk a little?" She shook her head. "No, not yet." Thomas nodded, understanding. He could carry her for a short distance, but the path was narrow and treacherous. He looked around, weighing his options. The canyon floor was uneven, strewn with rocks and thorny shrubs, but he knew of a small plateau a few miles ahead where he could rest and assess her injuries more thoroughly. He adjusted his grip, lifting her gently into his arms. She stiffened slightly but did not resist, and her eyes met his. There was a silent understanding passing between them. He would protect her, and she would trust him. At least for now. The journey through the canyon was slow. Every step required careful planning, as a single misstep could send both of them tumbling down the steep slopes. The girl, though wounded, tried to help by pointing out safer paths and warning of loose rocks.
Thomas marveled at her knowledge of the terrain.
"You know these canyons well," he said, impressed. She gave a small nod.
I've lived here all my life. My people taught me.
Her voice carried pride, even in her exhaustion. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher and hotter in the sky. Thomas's arms ached, and the girl's breathing was shallow and quick. They paused briefly under a small overhang, using it as shade from the relentless sun. Thomas tore a strip of cloth from his shirt to wrap gently around her arm, controlling the bleeding. "You're very brave," he said softly.
She looked at him and allowed a faint smile.
"I have to be," she said simply. As they continued, Thomas noticed the beauty of the canyon in a way he never had before. The red and gold cliffs, the way the light danced across the rocks, the quiet resilience of the desert plants, all of it seemed alive, almost protective.
He realized that this land had shaped her courage as much as any hardship.
She moved quietly in his arms, observing the cliffs and the sky, and for a moment the danger faded. By late afternoon, they reached the small plateau he had been aiming for. Thomas lowered her carefully to the ground, making sure she was comfortable. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting gratitude, fear, and determination, all at once. Narration.
"I don't know who you are," she said, "but thank you."
Thomas nodded, feeling a mix of relief and worry. The real challenge was only beginning, getting her safely to shelter, tending to her wounds properly, and navigating a world that might not welcome them. Yet in that moment, as the sun set and painted the canyon walls in fiery light, Thomas felt a spark of hope. This girl, brave and unyielding, had survived against all odds.
And he would do everything he could to ensure she survived a little longer.
Their story had begun in a place of danger and fear, but it would continue through courage, trust, and unexpected friendship, one careful step at a time. The sun had dipped lower behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the rocky plateau where Thomas and the young Apache girl had paused. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of earth and desert plants. Thomas carefully examined her injuries, using the small first aid knowledge he had gained from years on the ranch.
The girl, whose name he now knew was Ayana, watched him intently.
Despite her pain, she did not complain, though her eyes reflected a mixture of caution and curiosity. Thomas tore another strip from his shirt to make a bandage for her arm. Berate. "This will help keep it still," he explained gently, wrapping the cloth carefully.
Ayana flinched only once, the fear in her eyes momentarily giving way to trust.
"Desk. You've done this before?" she asked quietly, her voice hoarse but steady. Thomas shook his head.
Not really, but I've had to help hurt animals and people on the ranch.
It's not perfect, but it will hold for now. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. There was a silence between them for a few moments, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. After a pause, Ayana spoke again, her voice measured. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas looked at her carefully. It was a fair question. In those times, strangers often mistrusted each other, and she had no reason to trust a rancher.
He thought for a moment and replied honestly, "Because it's the right thing to do."
No one deserves to be left alone and hurt. She studied him, her dark eyes searching for any hint of deceit. When she found none, she gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of his words. The canyon was quiet now, but Thomas knew that danger could come from anywhere. He decided they could not stay in one place for long. "Don't. We need to move before nightfall," he said. "The canyon can be dangerous after dark, and I want to find a safer place for you to rest."
Ayana hesitated, then agreed, understanding that he was right.
Thomas gently lifted her into his arms again, careful to keep her injured arms steady. She offered no resistance, but her grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, as if bracing herself for the difficult journey ahead. They began to move down a narrow path that twisted between steep cliffs and loose rocks. Every step required attention, and Thomas often had to pause to test the ground for stability. Ayana, despite her injuries, pointed out hidden dips and loose stones that could trip him. Her knowledge of the canyon amazed him. "Birth."
"You've lived here long?" he asked. She nodded.
All my life. My family taught me how to survive.
"I know the land, even when it seems dangerous." Thomas marveled at her resilience. Even wounded and scared, she remained alert and capable, a stark contrast to her small, fragile appearance. As they descended, Thomas asked cautiously about the attack she had mentioned earlier. Ayana's expression hardened, and her eyes filled with sadness.
"Our village. Strangers came."
"They burned houses, took people away. I ran, and then I fell." She paused, swallowing hard. Thomas felt a knot in his stomach. He had heard of conflicts between settlers and native tribes, but hearing her story firsthand made it real. He wanted to comfort her, but he knew words could do little. Instead, he focused on guiding her safely through the canyon, one careful step at a time. Breaks. Hours passed, and the canyon shadows grew longer. Thomas and Ayana had to stop occasionally to rest. Each pause was brief, as the terrain offered little comfort and danger lurked in every shadow. During one stop, Thomas noticed how carefully she observed her surroundings, almost as if she could sense danger before it arrived.
You're very alert, he said.
"I have to be," she replied simply. "I've learned. It keeps me alive." Her words were quiet but full of meaning, and Thomas felt a deep respect for her courage. Despite the tension, small moments of humanity began to emerge. Breath. Thomas offered her a piece of dried meat from his pack. She took it without hesitation, her eyes flicking toward him with gratitude. Bration. Thank you, she said softly. He smiled faintly, glad to see a trace of normalcy in her demeanor, patient. As they moved forward, they shared brief stories of their lives. Ayana spoke of her village, the traditions her people followed, and the lessons she had learned from her family. Thomas told her about the ranch, the cattle he cared for, and the routines of a life spent in the desert.
Though their worlds were different, the exchange created a bridge of understanding between them.
The path grew steeper, and the sun dipped closer to the horizon. Thomas knew that nightfall would bring even more challenges. Bed. He scanned the canyon ahead, searching for a place where they could safely spend the night.
After a careful climb, he spotted a small ledge protected by overhanging rocks.
It was not large, but it would provide some shelter from the cold and the wind. He gently set Ayana down, helping her settle on a bed of dry grass and small blankets he carried in his pack. She looked at him, her eyes a mixture of relief and apprehension. As Thomas worked to secure their temporary shelter, Ayana's curiosity finally overcame her caution. "Why didn't you just leave me?" she asked quietly. Thomas paused, considering how to answer. "Because I couldn't," he said finally. "I couldn't leave someone hurt and alone, even if it meant danger for me. It's not right." She studied him, her expression softening slightly. "Most people don't think that way," she said. "Most people. They only think of themselves."
Thomas nodded, understanding her meaning.
In a world filled with fear and suspicion, small acts of kindness could feel like miracles. The evening settled over the canyon, bringing cooler air and the distant calls of night animals. Thomas built a small fire, careful to keep it contained and safe, and offered Ayana warmth. She watched the flames flicker, her eyes reflecting the dancing light. For a moment, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. In that quiet, Thomas realized that trust, once given, could grow quickly, even between strangers from different worlds. Ayana, though wary, had begun to trust him. He had no illusions about the danger still ahead, but he felt a sense of responsibility and determination stronger than fear. Bration. Thomas checked her injuries once more. The wound on her arm was serious, but with rest and care, she would recover. Break. He offered her some water from his canteen, and she drank slowly, her breathing steadying. "You've been through so much today," he said gently. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak fully. Her silence spoke volumes, a mixture of exhaustion, resilience, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond forming between them. Thomas thought about the journey that lay ahead. They would need to navigate the canyon, avoid dangers from both nature and people, and find a safe place for her to heal. Breath. Yet despite the challenges, he felt a sense of purpose. Ayana's courage had inspired him, reminding him of the strength that could exist even in the most vulnerable of people. He realized that the canyon, harsh and unforgiving as it was, had shaped her into someone capable of surviving against great odds. Hours passed, and Thomas finally allowed himself to rest. Ayana leaned against a rock, her eyes closing briefly as exhaustion claimed her. He watched her, feeling a deep sense of protectiveness. This young girl, wounded and alone, had faced dangers that many adults would have feared. And yet, here she was, alive, defiant, and brave. Thomas knew that their journey together had only just begun, but he also knew that with trust, courage, and careful steps, they could face whatever lay ahead. In the stillness of the night, the canyon seemed to whisper around them. Thomas thought about the stories the land could tell, the hardships, the triumphs, the moments of unexpected kindness. He realized that this night and this encounter would become one of those stories. A story of survival, trust, and the quiet courage of a young girl who refused to give up, even when trapped and hurt. And as he sat by the fire listening to the wind and the distant calls of the night, Thomas made a silent promise to himself. He would protect her, guide her, and ensure that her courage was not wasted. The night stretched on, the stars above twinkling faintly through the canyon walls. Thomas and Ayanna rested, each lost in their own thoughts. For Thomas, it was the responsibility of care and the uncertainty of what was to come. For Ayanna, it was the lingering fear of her past and the cautious hope for the future. And though the canyon was quiet, the bond between them had begun to form, a bond that would be tested, strengthened, and remembered in the days to come. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the canyon, Thomas and Ayanna were ready to continue their journey. The dangers of the canyon had not vanished, but with courage, patience, and mutual trust, they were prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them. And though neither could foresee the trials ahead, both knew that this day, this moment, had changed them forever. Morning light spilled into the canyon, painting the cliffs in soft shades of pink and gold. Thomas stirred, careful not to wake Ayanna, who was still resting after the long night. Her face was pale, and the bandage around her arm had kept the worst of the swelling in check, but he knew she still needed rest. He looked around, assessing the path ahead. The canyon was quiet, the wind whispering through the rocks. But Thomas knew that the terrain could be treacherous.
One wrong step could mean a fall, and they both had to be careful.
Breath. After a few moments, he gently shook her shoulder. "It's time to move," he said softly. Bah. Ayanna opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the bright light. "I'm ready," she whispered. Her voice was calm, but Thomas could see the lingering pain in her expression. He offered his hand, and she took it, letting him help her stand. Her legs were wobbly, but she was determined. Thomas felt a surge of admiration. Even after everything she had endured, she refused to let weakness slow her down.
They began their journey down the canyon trail.
Thomas carried some of her weight at first, but she insisted on walking on her own as much as possible.
"I can manage," she said firmly, adjusting the sling that supported her arm.
Thomas nodded, understanding that independence was important to her. They moved slowly, carefully navigating the uneven ground and loose stones. Every now and then, Ayanna would point out a safer path or warn him of a rock that seemed loose. Her knowledge of the canyon amazed him, and he realized that her survival so far was due not only to courage but to intelligence and awareness. As they walked, Thomas tried to learn more about her village. "How far is it from here?" he asked. Ayanna thought for a moment. "Not far, but dangerous," she said. "Many people have passed through, some not friendly. I ran as far as I could, and then I fell." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. Thomas felt a knot in his stomach. She had survived an attack, fallen and been trapped, and now depended entirely on him. Breaths. He had to protect her. The canyon walls began to narrow, and the path grew steeper. Thomas moved carefully, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. Loose gravel shifted under his boots, and he tested each step before putting his full weight down. Ayanna stayed close, sometimes grabbing his arm for support. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to rise. Thomas knew they had to find shade soon or risk exhaustion. He spotted a small overhang, just large enough for them to rest. They reached it and settled down briefly, respective Ayanna some water from his canteen, and she drank slowly, savoring each sip. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded. "We need to stay strong. The canyon may be dangerous, but we can make it if we are careful."
Ayanna looked at him and nodded, her dark eyes showing determination.
Despite her youth, She seemed to understand the risks better than many adults would. After a short rest, they resumed their journey. The canyon grew wilder, with cliffs rising sharply on either side. Thomas led the way, carefully testing each step. Ayanna followed closely, sometimes pointing out an easier route.
There, she would say, and he would adjust his path accordingly.
He marveled at her bravery. Even after being hurt and scared, she remained alert, focused, and willing to help. Her resilience inspired him to keep going, even when his arms ached from helping her. As the day progressed, the sun climbed high overhead, making the rocks hot and the air dry. Thomas noticed signs of wildlife, tracks in the dust, a lizard darting between rocks, the distant call of a hawk. Ayanna paused to observe, her knowledge of the land evident in the way she recognized the tracks and identified safe areas. "Watch your step here," she said, pointing to a loose patch of gravel. Thomas nodded and carefully adjusted his path. Her guidance was invaluable. Without it, the journey would have been much more dangerous. Around midday, Thomas spotted a small stream winding through the canyon. The sight brought a sense of relief. They could rest, drink water, and cool off for a while.
He helped Ayanna to a flat rock near the water's edge, letting her sit and sip from the stream carefully.
"Good thinking," he said, smiling. She looked at him with a faint smile of her own. For the first time, there was a small moment of lightness in the day. While resting, Thomas tried to talk more about her life before the attack. "What was your village like?" he asked. Ayanna closed her eyes briefly, remembering.
It was small. Families lived together in simple homes.
We hunted, gathered, and helped each other. We had celebrations, songs, and stories. I loved my family." Her voice broke slightly, and Thomas felt a pang of sadness.
"I'm sorry you lost them," he said softly. She shook her head.
"I survived. That is what matters now." Her words were firm, almost like a promise to herself. After their brief rest, Thomas helped her up. "We should keep moving," he said. "We are not safe staying in one place too long." Ayanna nodded, adjusting her sling and taking small, careful steps. Thomas followed, alert to every sound, every movement around them. The canyon was quiet, but he knew danger could be anywhere. Slipping rocks, wild animals, or even people with bad intentions. They climbed higher into the canyon, the trail winding through narrow passages and steep inclines. Thomas often had to pause to help Ayanna over difficult spots. Each time she struggled, she refused to give up, her determination stronger than any pain. He admired her courage and silently promised to keep her safe no matter what. She in turn began to trust him more. Her glances became less wary, and occasionally she offered him advice on the safest way forward. Their teamwork grew stronger with each step. By late afternoon, the canyon opened into a small plateau, a place where they could rest and gather strength. Thomas set Ayanna down gently, letting her sit on a flat rock. She looked around, her eyes scanning the canyon walls. "This is safer," she said. Asked patience. Thomas agreed. They had reached a spot where the terrain was more stable, and the risk of falling rocks was lower. It was not a permanent solution, but it would allow them to rest before continuing the journey. While she rested, Thomas gathered some dry wood and built a small fire. The warmth and light provided comfort, and for the first time they could relax slightly. Ayanna watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "You are very strong," she said softly. Thomas smiled faintly. "Yes, you've been through a lot too. Strength comes in many ways." She looked down, but he could see a small smile on her face. The firelight seemed to ease some of the tension between them. As the evening approached, Thomas checked her injuries again. The bandage on her arm was secure, and she had been able to rest without too much discomfort. He offered her some more water and a small piece of bread from his pack. She accepted quietly, eating slowly.
You have done more for me than anyone else ever has, she said, her voice small but sincere.
Thomas shook his head. I am just helping, that is all.
Yet, deep down, he knew that their journey had changed both of them.
They had formed a bond through trust, care, and shared determination. Night began to fall, and the canyon grew cooler. Thomas covered Ayana with a blanket, making sure she was comfortable.
We will continue.
Tomorrow, he said gently. She nodded, her eyes closing as exhaustion took over. Thomas sat by the fire, thinking about the day. They had faced many challenges, but they had also learned to work together. He realized that the canyon, harsh as it was, had taught them both lessons in patience, courage, and trust. As he watched over her, Thomas reflected on the bond that had formed. Ayana, despite her youth and injuries, had shown remarkable bravery. She had survived attacks, falls, and the harsh terrain, and she had begun to trust a stranger. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that together they could face it. The canyon might be unforgiving, but it had also brought them together in a way that neither of them could have expected. The night passed quietly. The fire burned low, and Thomas stayed awake, alert to any sound. Ayana slept peacefully, her breathing steady. He felt a sense of responsibility stronger than any fear. He would protect her, guide her, and ensure that she survived. And as the first light of dawn crept into the canyon, Thomas knew that the next day would bring new challenges. Yet he was ready. Together, they would continue the journey, moving forward with courage, patience, and trust in each other. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and earth. Thomas stirred first, carefully ensuring that Ayana was still resting peacefully. Her breathing was steady, and though the swelling on her arm had slightly decreased, he knew she was still weak from the previous day's fall and long journey. Gently he shook her shoulder. "It's time to move," he said softly. Ayana opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the soft morning light. "I'm ready," she whispered. Thomas helped her to sit, adjusting the sling that supported her arm. She stood carefully, testing her legs before taking her first few steps. Though her movements were slow, there was determination in each one. Thomas offered his arm, which she accepted without hesitation. "We'll take it slow," he said. "The canyon can be tricky, but I'll guide you." She nodded, trusting him. Their journey had begun with danger, but now a new challenge awaited them. Getting her safely to a place where she could heal and recover while avoiding dangers that could still be lurking. As they moved through the canyon, Ayana began to ask questions, curiosity replacing some of the fear that had dominated her the day before. "Why do you live here?" she asked, glancing around at the towering cliffs and vast stretches of rocky terrain. Thomas smiled faintly. "It's where my family has always lived. We have our ranches and our cattle. It's hard work, but the land teaches you many things if you pay attention."
Ayana nodded thoughtfully. "I know what you mean," she said quietly.
But the land teaches you how to survive if you listen.
Thomas looked at her with admiration. For someone so young, she had endured more than many adults would ever face, yet her mind was alert and her spirit strong.
Hours passed as they navigated the narrow paths and uneven rocks. Thomas guided her carefully, pointing out safe footholds and alerting her to loose gravel or overhanging rocks. Occasionally they stopped to rest in small shaded areas, where Ayuna would drink water and regain a little strength. Despite her injuries, she often helped him by spotting safer paths or warning him of hidden dangers. "Over there," she would say, pointing to a safer route, and Thomas would adjust their path accordingly. He marveled at her alertness and intelligence, realizing that she had survived not only because of courage but because of her careful awareness of the world around her. During a brief stop, Thomas asked gently, "Do you remember your village, what it was like before the attack?" Ayana's expression softened, a mix of sadness and nostalgia appearing in her dark eyes.
It was small, but it was everything to us. Families lived together, helped one another, and celebrated together.
We hunted, gathered, and told stories of our ancestors.
"I loved my home,"
She said softly, her voice tinged with pain.
Thomas nodded quietly, understanding the weight of her words. She had lost everything, yet her resilience remained intact. The terrain grew more difficult as they continued.
The canyon narrowed, cliffs rose higher, and the trail became steeper. Thomas took the lead, testing every step before moving forward, while Ayana followed closely, occasionally leaning on him for support. Despite the challenges, she refused to give up. Her determination inspired Thomas, reminding him that courage often came from the most unexpected places. Each careful step strengthened the bond between them, built on trust, respect, and shared determination to survive. By midday, they reached a small clearing with a stream winding through it. The sight brought relief. Thomas guided Ayana to a flat rock near the water's edge, letting her sit and drink carefully. The cool water revitalized her slightly, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the simple comfort. Thomas watched her closely, knowing that she needed more than just water. She needed rest, food, and safety. He gathered small stones and dry wood to build a tiny fire, enough to offer warmth and a sense of comfort while they rested. As they rested, Thomas began speaking about life on the ranch.
"We have cattle, horses, and sometimes we trade with nearby settlements. Life is hard, but it teaches you patience and responsibility," he explained.
Ayana listened intently, her curiosity shining through despite her fatigue.
"It sounds very different from my village," she said.
"But I understand what you mean. Life always teaches you lessons if you are willing to learn."
Her words struck Thomas deeply.
For all her hardship, she had not lost her insight and her ability to understand the world around her. The afternoon passed slowly, the sun warming the canyon walls and making the rocks shimmer in golden light. Thomas helped Ayana to her feet, supporting her as they prepared to continue. They had to keep moving if they wanted to reach a safer location before nightfall. Step by step, they followed the winding trail, sometimes walking in silence, other times exchanging stories of their lives. Thomas spoke of the ranch, the hard work it required, and the simple pleasures of tending to animals and watching the land change with the seasons. Ayana, in turn, shared stories of her village, the traditions, the songs, and the celebrations.
Their worlds were different, yet the sharing of stories created understanding and connection.
As evening approached, the canyon's shadows grew longer, and the air became cooler. They reached a small plateau where the terrain was more stable, providing a safe place to rest for the night. Thomas helped Ayana sit on a flat rock, adjusting her sling and offering her a small piece of bread he carried in his pack. She ate slowly, savoring the simple meal, and looked up at him with gratitude. "Breaths, you've helped me so much," she said softly. Thomas shook his head. "I am only doing what is right," he replied. Yet he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his efforts were making a difference in her life. Night fell, bringing cooler air and the distant sounds of the canyon at night. Thomas built a small fire to provide warmth and light, keeping the flames low and contained. Ayana watched the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering glow. For a moment, the hardships of the day seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet comfort and the growing trust between them. Thomas checked her injuries once more, ensuring that her arm was secure and that she was comfortable. She nodded, showing a small smile of appreciation. The night passed quietly, the fire crackling softly. Thomas remained alert, watching over Ayana as she slept peacefully. He reflected on their journey and the bond that had formed. She had survived so much already: attacks, injury, and the harsh terrain, and yet her spirit remained unbroken. He realized that this journey had changed both of them, teaching lessons in courage, trust, and resilience. Breath. By dawn, the canyon was bathed in soft light. Thomas gently woke Ayana, who stirred and sat up carefully. "Ready to continue?" he asked. She nodded, her movements slow but determined. Together they began the next stage of their journey, moving with caution but also with growing confidence. The canyon remained unpredictable, but their trust in each other had strengthened. Every step forward was a step toward safety, toward healing, and toward understanding. As they moved, Thomas noticed the small signs of life around them, the tracks of animals, the rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of birds. Ayana pointed out these signs, her knowledge of the land remarkable. "We are not alone," she said quietly. "There is life everywhere, even in hard places." Thomas nodded, appreciating her observation. The canyon, harsh and rugged as it was, had taught them both lessons in observation, patience, and survival.
Hours later, they reached another plateau with a small overhang providing shelter. Thomas helped Ayana settle, and she leaned against the rocks, exhausted but alert.
He checked her wounds carefully, ensuring that everything was secure. She drank water and ate a small portion of food from his pack, her energy slowly returning. Thomas felt a deep respect for her resilience and determination. Despite all she had endured, she refused to give up. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in brilliant shades of orange and red, Thomas and Ayana sat together quietly. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had survived together. The bond between them had grown stronger, built on trust, courage, and shared hardship. Thomas realized that their journey was far from over, but he felt confident that together they could face the challenges ahead. That night, Thomas kept the fire low and watched over Ayana as she slept. He reflected on the lessons they had learned, about the land, about courage, and about the power of trust. Ayana's bravery and resilience had inspired him, and he knew that their journey would continue to teach both of them. The canyon, once a place of danger, had become a place of growth, connection, and understanding. And as the stars appeared above the cliffs, Thomas made a silent promise. He would guide her, protect her, and ensure that she survived.
Ayana, in turn, had shown him the strength that could exist even in the youngest and most vulnerable.
Brash. Together they would face whatever lay ahead, step by step, with courage, patience, and trust in each other. The sun rose slowly over the canyon, painting the cliffs in soft golden and orange hues. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dry earth and desert plants. Thomas carefully woke Ayana, who had slept through most of the night, her dark hair falling across her face. "It's time to continue," he said gently. She stirred, blinking against the light, and nodded. Though her arms still ached and her body was tired, there was determination in her eyes. They both knew that the next leg of their journey was crucial. They needed to find safety and get her back to her people. Thomas helped Ayana to her feet and adjusted her sling.
"We'll take it slow," he said.
"There's no rush, but we must keep moving. The canyon can be unpredictable." She nodded, gripping his arm lightly for support as they began down the trail. Step by step, they navigated the uneven terrain, careful of loose rocks and narrow passages. Each movement required focus, but their growing trust in one another gave them confidence. Thomas marveled at her resilience. Thomas marveled at her resilience. Even after all she had endured, she refused to give in to fear or weakness. As they walked, Thomas asked gently, "Do you remember the path to your village? Do you think we can reach it safely?" Ayanna thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the cliffs and the canyon below. "I remember some paths," she said, "but some are dangerous. We must avoid the cliffs where the rocks are loose and the areas where water can suddenly rise after rain." Thomas nodded. Her knowledge of the land was invaluable, and he relied on her guidance as much as she relied on his strength. The journey continued through narrow trails and winding passes, but Ayanna insisted on walking whenever she could. "I must keep moving," she said firmly.
"If I don't, I will grow weaker." He admired her courage and determination. Step by step they moved forward, their bond growing stronger with every obstacle they overcame.
The canyon was unforgiving, but together they had learned to navigate its dangers. By mid-morning, they reached a small clearing with a gentle stream running through it. The sight brought relief. Thomas helped Ayanna sit on a flat rock near the water, and she drank carefully, savoring the cool liquid. He took a moment to rest, observing her closely. Her eyes reflected a mix of determination and exhaustion. "You are very brave," he said softly. She gave a small nod. "I have to be," she replied. "If I stop, everything I've survived will be for nothing." Thomas understood. Survival was not just about strength. It was about courage, patience, and the will to keep going even when the path was hard. After a brief rest, they continued, following the winding trail that led deeper into the canyon. The cliffs grew taller and the shadows stretched across the path. Thomas stayed alert, watching for loose rocks and hidden dangers. Ayanna stayed close, sometimes pointing out safer routes or warning of uneven footing. "Here!" she would say, guiding him around a patch of gravel. Her awareness of the terrain saved them more than once. Thomas realized that she had learned to survive not only through courage, but through careful observation and intelligence. As afternoon approached, they reached a ridge that offered a view of the surrounding landscape. Below them, the canyon opened into a wide valley, and Thomas could see signs of settlements in the distance. He pointed toward the valley. "That is where we need to go," he said. Ayanna's eyes lit up. "I know the way," she said. "There. If we move carefully, we can reach the edge safely." Thomas nodded. The sight of familiar land gave her hope, and hope was a powerful thing in the face of fear and exhaustion. The final part of their journey was the most challenging. The trail narrowed, and the canyon walls rose steeply on either side. Loose rocks threatened every step, and the air was dry and heavy.
Thomas guided Ayanna carefully, helping her over difficult spots and supporting her whenever she faltered.
Despite her injuries and fatigue, she kept going, her determination unwavering. They moved as a team, each trusting the other completely. Every step forward was a victory, and neither allowed fear to slow them down. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in deep orange and red, they reached the edge of the valley. The view was breathtaking. Below them, the open land stretched for miles, dotted with trees, streams, and the faint outlines of distant settlements. Ayanna looked down, her eyes shining. "We made it," she whispered. Thomas smiled, relief washing over him. They had survived the dangers of the canyon, guided by courage, trust, and determination. Carefully, they began their descent into the valley. The terrain was easier here, and Ayanna was able to walk more freely. The journey was not over, but the worst was behind them. As they moved, they talked quietly, sharing hopes and fears. Ayana spoke of her family, the life she had lost, and the dreams she still carried. Thomas shared stories of the ranch, the animals he cared for, and the lessons he had learned from the land. Their conversations were simple but meaningful, building understanding and connection between two very different worlds. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of her village's territory. Thomas guided her to a safe distance where she could rest without risk. "This is as far as I can go," he said gently. Ayana looked at him, her dark eyes filled with gratitude.
Thank you, she said softly.
"For everything. I would not have survived without you." Thomas smiled faintly.
"You are stronger than you realize," he replied, "and you would have survived."
"I only helped a little." They spent a few moments in silence, taking in the valley and the land that stretched before them. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. Thomas had seen courage and resilience in a young girl who had endured more than most adults could imagine. Ayana had learned to trust a stranger, relying on his guidance and care when the world had seemed harsh and unforgiving. Their journey had taught both of them lessons about survival, empathy, and the power of human connection. Finally, it was time to part ways. Thomas knelt slightly, adjusting her sling one last time. "Be careful," he said. "Stay strong, and remember what you've learned." Ayana nodded, standing tall despite her fatigue.
"I will," she said. "And I will never forget you." They shared a quiet moment of understanding, knowing that their paths had crossed for a reason.
The canyon had tested them both, but it had also brought them together in a way that would leave a lasting mark. Ayana carefully made her way toward her village, guided by the familiar landmarks she had described earlier. Thomas watched until she disappeared into the distance, her small figure moving with determination and strength.
He felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that she was safe, and sadness that their journey together had come to an end.
But he also felt pride. Pride in her courage, in the bond they had formed, and in the knowledge that he had played a part in her survival. As Thomas turned back toward his own ranch, he reflected on the events of the past days. The canyon had been harsh, unforgiving, and dangerous. But it had also been a place of growth, learning, and connection. He realized that the experience had changed him as much as it had changed Ayana. He had learned about courage, resilience, and the importance of trust and empathy. He had witnessed the strength of a young girl who refused to give up, even when the odds were against her. In the days that followed, Thomas returned to his routine on the ranch, but he carried with him the memory of Ayana and their journey. The story of the wounded girl in the canyon and the rancher who helped her became something he would reflect on often, a reminder of the power of kindness, bravery, and human connection. He knew that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that the lessons they had learned together would stay with him forever. Meanwhile, Ayana returned to her village, wary but stronger. She shared her story with her people, the story of survival, trust, and courage. She spoke of the stranger who had guided her through the canyon, who had protected her when danger surrounded them. Her words carried hope, inspiring others to be brave and to trust in the kindness of others, even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. In the end, their journey was more than just a passage through a dangerous canyon. It was a journey of understanding, empathy, and resilience. Both Thomas and Ayana had faced fear and uncertainty, and both had emerged stronger. They had learned that courage was not just about strength, but about persistence, trust, and the willingness to care for others. The canyon had tested them, but it had also shown them the best parts of themselves. And though they would walk different paths from now on, the memory of their journey would remain with them. Ayana would carry the lessons of survival, courage, and trust into her life and her community. Thomas would remember the bravery and spirit of the young girl he had helped, a reminder of the impact that one act of kindness could have on a life past.
Their story became one of hope, connection, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, a story that would be remembered long after the canyon had returned to silence.